Welcoming you to a life of awareness, the Presence Project is excited for you to join us for today's podcast with your host, Paul Kersner.
Hello and welcome to episode 87 of Are You Being Present? My name is Paul. I want to welcome you to the present moment. I want to welcome you to the here and now. And I want to thank you wholeheartedly and sincerely for joining me in this amazing, unprecedented present moment. The title and topic of today's podcast is Stop Listening to That Loud Voice in Your Head with Presence. This is a topic that is relevant to everyone, as everyone on earth has an ego. And I've talked in previous podcasts about the ego and the loud voice, and it is always worthy to listen again to provide more information about what this loud voice is, what tools you can use to quiet it down, how to live your life in a state of observation to understand what that loud voice is doing and how it's been controlling you all this time. It's quite a quandary that we have as human beings, that we have to contend with an ego. That ego is a component of your personality. It typically is formed at a very young age, usually in times of trauma. And it is always there with you. And when you're younger, you practically live through your ego. Your ego completely controls you. And you have no life experience, or you don't have sufficient enough life experience to understand what that is. We don't teach our children that they don't have to listen to that voice in their head, that loud voice in their head. They become overly connected to that loud voice in their head, and they act through that loud voice in their head. But what is the ego? The ego is a component of your personality. It's a part of you. It's going to be with you for the rest of your life. And what I talk about with patients is changing that relationship with the ego, because typically the ego is like the CEO of your life. And you aren't even on the executive team. You're a cog all the way down the organizational chart. And when I first start working with patients, it's quite striking for them to realize what's actually been going on, and that they don't have to listen to the voice in their heads, that loud voice in their head. So my message for this podcast and for all of you is that you don't have to listen to that loud voice in your head. In this present moment, are you listening to that loud voice in your head? And what is that loud voice in your head telling you? What is it making you think? What is it making you feel? How is it manipulating you? Because if you're listening to that loud voice, is that really you? And the answer is no. But you become so overly identified with it that you believe it's you. The ego is so tricky that it uses the same tone in your head to make you believe that it must be you. But the truth is that it's not you. The truth is that it's a part of you, but we have to learn what it is, how it is, and how to work with it. More importantly, we have to be present so we can observe the ego to see what it's doing at all times. Entering into a state of observation is quintessential. Because without being observant of the ego and that loud voice in your head, you become overly reactive to all the different thoughts and feelings that ego, that loud voice makes you think and feel. Typically, the stimulus that the ego is firing up has very little to do with what's actually happening in the present moment. It's not to say that that's the case all the time. But I would say 95% of your present moments, when your ego is involved, it's making you think things, worry about things, ruminate about things that have very little to do with what's unfolding for you. So awakening to the voice in your head allows you to see what it's doing to you. And the ego serves very little purpose most of the time. Now, when humans were living on the Serengeti and getting chased by lions, the ego did serve a very valuable purpose. And it kept people safe. And there are times as we go throughout our life that there are moments where we are in situations that aren't safe and we do need the ego. But it's a very small percentage of the time. And since the ego doesn't have a purpose most of the time, it creates a purpose for itself because it has a radar and it's constantly looking for problems or things that it knows will bother you. It shows up in times when you're vulnerable, whether you're tired, you're hungry, you're weak, whatever it is. Like, the ego knows you so well that it knows the most inopportune times for you, but the most opportune times for it to chime in and to send you and to start you into a loop of thought and emotion. And it's always negative. I don't ever see a positive purpose for the ego except for those rare instances when we are in situations that are unsafe. So I'm not saying that 100% of the time the ego is useless. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm saying that most of the time that loud voice in your head is destructive. It's distracting. It's taking you out of the moment by making you think things and feel things that have no relevance to who you are in that moment. But no one sits in front of us and tells us, hey, wait a second, you don't have to listen to that voice in your head, and asking you, what is that loud voice in your head telling you? And why is it telling you these things? It's your ego. I personally had a very destructive ego all throughout my life, mostly. And I had to do a lot of ego work that started in my mid-20s and kept on going until now, and it's still going, where I have to use all of my tools to make sure that I'm present to understand what, if I'm overly attached to or listening to my ego. Ego work is a big part of the work that I do with my patients. It's a very, very big part of the work that I do in my mentorships. I teach ego work, but I do ego work because I am constantly in a state of observation trying to understand why it is that I feel the way I do and what that voice is telling me. The more ego work that you do, the greater the state of observation that you're in, the more of a chance you have not to be reactive to that loud voice in your head. So the more work you do, the bigger the gap is from when that loud voice chimes in versus when you would typically have reacted. And if you get into a state of observation and you're doing your work, you can actually pause, take some time to understand what's going on with clarity, and then respond. And I've talked at length about the difference between reaction and response. The ego loves to trigger us into a state of reaction because it gets us stuck in a loop, which is very detrimental to being present and seeing things for what they are. But again, we are not given the tools that we need as children and then young adults and then into our adulthood about how to contend with that loud voice in your head. And over the past 13 years that I've been working with patients, I've been amazed and also taken back by the destructive qualities of the ego and the suffering that it creates, most of the time self-inflicted. No reason for it to go on any further. The challenge is that you have to be objective and not judgmental based on what's taken place in the past or even in this present moment so that you could better understand the relationship that you're having with your ego. And one of the tools that I want to share with you is giving your ego a name. It's normal, and everyone has a voice in their head, a very loud voice in your head. If you have multiple voices in your head, yes, you might want to seek help, but it's typically one very loud voice in your head. And the first step, or one of the first few steps, is to give your ego a name, or to ask your ego what his or her name is. You might get a response. It might take some time, or you might have to assign it a name. This is a very important step in doing your ego work because it allows you to start disassociating and detaching from that ego, from that construct, so that you can address it and work with it. It's not to fight the ego, it's to identify the ego, to understand what it's doing, when it's doing it, and how it's doing it, and why it's doing it. And the ego is self-serving, so it makes it seem like it's for you and protecting you, but most of the time it's not. It's serving itself and creating a purpose for itself. I've gone through ego work with a lot of people, and I continue to do it with myself. And this step about giving it a name, whatever the name is, helps to build that gap out between when the ego's chiming in and between when you typically react. Because no longer are you so associated with it, believing that it's you. That voice, that loud voice, that destructive voice is not you. And giving it that name is a wonderful step in doing your work so that you can maintain a state of presence and not be distracted by the ceaseless and senseless chatter of the ego. I know firsthand what it's like to have a very destructive ego. My ego was relentless from morning till night. It used to play mental movies. It would make me think things, worry about things, ruminate about things all the time. And I was committed to doing my ego work because I understood that for me to achieve or maintain a state of presence and peace, that I couldn't allow this component of my personality, this loud voice, to constantly take me out of the moment, to constantly make me feel things that aren't so, to make me feel fear. And that is one of the strongest tools of the ego, is that it makes us afraid of things. And fear comes in all different forms. So the ego will try all different measures to make you anxious, to make you sad, to make you frustrated, to make you angry, to make you fearful. And it's up to you to do your work in those present moments to identify that loud voice, not to fight it per se. Because when you first start doing your ego work and you first start challenging the ego by not listening to it, it starts to get louder. And that's a very interesting step because it's almost like a 3 or 4 year old child. And for those parents who've had children, they know at 3 or 4 years old when they're having meltdowns that you can't yell at that child or control that child. You have to let the child get it out. And you can observe the child, but you have to let it run its course. And eventually it'll burn out and then it'll be done. It's the same thing when you're doing your work, your ego work, with this loud voice in your head. In the beginning, it's going to get louder. And I'm not saying that you should expect it to get louder, but it's typically a point and a part of doing your ego work, especially when you finally create some space between you and that component and you give it a name. It's going to get louder and more intense. And I would tell you that to just keep on doing your work, because you'll get to a point where eventually it will burn out, and then you'll experience points and moments in time where you won't be dominated by that loud voice in your head, where you'll find peace in the moment. And this is a major revelation for a lot of people. This was a major revelation for myself, because I saw that the more work I did, the more committed I was to doing ego work and not listening to that loud voice in my head, the easier things were, the more peaceful my life was and is when I'm in a state of observation. And again, I really want to stress that it's not to destroy the ego. It's not to fight or the ego. You fight the ego is always going to win, because the ego, your ego, knows you better than you know yourself, practically. It's been with you that long. It knows all your vulnerabilities. It knows what to make you think, when to make you think, to take you out of that moment. And that's amazing and terrifying at the same time. But this information helps shift your understanding. It gives you the knowledge, the tools that you need so that you can stop listening to that loud voice in your head. You can understand better what's actually going on inside your head, and you could become the CEO of your life, and you can downgrade that ego. And again, it's not to challenge it in a way that you're combative. It's more of a way of letting it know that you don't need it to be telling you what to do all the time anymore. And this is a wonderful moment for a lot of people, because when you live your life, your entire life, overly identified with that loud voice in your head, and you think it's you think it's always going to be like that. That's what I thought until I kept on doing my work. And I got to a point where I was able to really reshape the relationship I was having with that loud voice in my head. And I was able to catch it. And I was able to exist within more present moments where there was quiet. And I was more in control of what was going on. It's impossible to be in full control, because control is a tool of the ego. The ego wants you to make you think that you can control things. You can't even really control your body. You can just influence it. But you can have some level of influence over what's going on when you're not being completely dominated by that loud voice in your head. Now, Western medicine and the therapeutic model will talk about the ego in a much more complex way. I like an oversimplification because there's no need to complicate what's going on with you. We'll make it really simple. There's a loud voice in your head. It's your ego. It's been very destructive. It's created a lot of suffering, and we can end it now if we change the relationship between you and that loud voice. I don't think I need to go any deeper into this topic. I think it's really helpful to present it as such, and I've done this over and over again in clinic, and it's my life's work. And I feel really grateful to sit in front of people and share this information, because I know the relief that I received when I started doing it, as I continue to do my ego work. And it's just such an honor to watch people's eyes brighten up when they realize that what I'm teaching them is extremely useful, and that there can be some peace in their life, in their head, that they no longer need to be overly associated and dominated by that loud voice anymore going forward. As always, it is such an honor and pleasure to be able to share these present seconds with you, and I wish you all nothing but peace.
Thank you for listening to the Are You Being Present podcast, brought to you by the Presence Projects. Remember, you have a choice. Choose to be present.